Hello, my name is Michael Rainville and welcome to Mirror on the Metro. We're going to have a great show for you tonight and it's going to be all about St. Anthony Village. We have the author of a new book about St. Anthony Village, Gail Olsen. Welcome to Mirror on the Metro and to Metro Cable Channel 6.
Thank you very much.
So tell us, how did you ever get involved with writing a book about the history of St. Anthony Village?
The St. Anthony Historical Society decided that they wanted to do a book on the history of St. Anthony because there was nothing in writing that existed on the history. And they asked me to do the book because I had 22 years of experience as a community reporter, and we did history stories, and a lot of them were about St. Anthony. So they gave me a list of 52 people to interview, and I ended up interviewing about 120.
120 people?
Yeah.
That must have been a lot of fun.
It was really fun. The thing about St. Anthony is a lot of the original families are still in the area, and I talked to one man who is he still lives in his family's original farmhouse on Harding Street in St. Anthony. So it was easy to track down a lot of the people that had the history.
And the history runs very deep. It goes actually back to the Revolutionary War in the Northwest Territories, and St. Anthony at one time was part of the Wisconsin territories.
Right. The book does start with the Revolutionary War when they were dividing up all the states. And when they divided the Indiana and Wisconsin, originally St. Anthony Township was part of that, but then when the borders were drawn, it was left out. So then it became part of the Minnesota territories.
And then originally it was Washington County, Ramsey County, and then later in actually 1858 it became part of Hennepin County.
Hennepin County took it over. And right now, one of the interesting things about St. Anthony is that it actually lies in two counties. Hennepin County goes all the way up to 37th, and north of 37th is Ramsey County.
And in your book you have a very interesting story about this two-county jurisdiction due to the unfortunate death of a gentleman in a grocery store.
Police Chief Don Hickerson told me a story that occurred in the 1960s where a man had a heart attack and died in a supermarket, and Chief Hickerson called the Hennepin County medical examiner to come take the body away, and the Hennepin County examiner said, "That's not Hennepin County, it's Ramsey County." So he and the medical examiner were on the phone for an hour and a half arguing about what county this dead body was in, while shoppers were pushing their shopping carts around this poor man who was lying in the aisle with a sheet over him.
Oh, what a way to go. Well, let's go into the book a little bit here, Gail. In fact, you have some great photos that we're going to talk a little bit about. Starting in the 20s, it was St. Anthony Village was farm life. That's what it was, farm and woods.
These are hog farmers. This is Gordon Peterson and John Lakotas. What they would do is they would go into the downtown restaurants in Minneapolis and they would pick up the garbage. And they would bring the garbage back and shovel it out to their hogs. So the hogs were eating really fancy food from restaurants.
They're eating good, huh?
Yeah, they were.
And also in that era, you interviewed Dorothy Offer and Millie Walquist. They had some really interesting stories about getting an education back in the 1920s.
This is the original grade school. It was built in 1918. And after the kids graduated from this school, they would walk all the way down to Edison. That was the only high school in the area. And that's about 30 blocks. So it was downhill one way and uphill coming back.
And she also said that the kids at Edison would give her a hard time because she was a country girl.
It was real interesting about St. Anthony in that in the early days when it was all farm, the kids that went to Edison, a lot of them, their parents were shop owners, and they were considered a little higher class than the farm kids, so they would look down their noses at the farm kids. When St. Anthony actually incorporated in 1945, that changed because a lot of the people that moved in were Honeywell engineers and University of Minnesota professors. They were people with more money. So
a little different than the middle class of Northeast.
Right.
And then also the 30s or the 20s saw the founding of the Salvation Army camp on Silver Lake.
This camp was 100 years old when it got sold to Silverwood. It's a regional park now, but this used to be the place where people from the big city would come for their North Woods experience. It was a Salvation Army camp. This is a dance in the 1920s. And I think the next slides, these are kids riding a pony at the Salvation Army camp. And there's another one where you can see the camp building and all the campers.
Well, that looks like a lot of fun. So then let's go up into the 1930s, and the farms got a little bigger and more successful with the growth of the metropolitan area. Ted Paul and Mr. McGinnis were really big farmers back then. A. McGinnis. And in fact, Ted Paul, he later became the first mayor of St. Anthony.
That's right, he did. There's a lot of streets that are named. There's a Paul Avenue in St. Anthony that was named after him.
And then also at this time in the 30s, Kenzie's Tavern and Gas Station came into existence.
Everybody knew about Kenzie's Tavern. It was where Lowry and Stinson Avenue are now. There's a Bremer Bank at the site. It was at a point of land, and they sold liquor and they sold gas. And those were the early businesses in St. Anthony.
It was a real social hub right then.
Yep.
Yeah. Interesting, too, in the book, in the 30s, you have a lot of the memories from the residents back then. As you said, most of the people are alive that helped found St. Anthony. And so John Johnson and Harry Mickelchuk, they had a great story about sledding and how long you could slide down a hill.
This was before the developers came in and graded all the hills down so they could build houses. But John R. Johnson, whose family founded a greenhouse, he used to talk about being able to slide from the school on 33rd and Silver Lake Road to his house. And he had a pretty good run of about 10 blocks on his stomach on his sled.
Take you all day to walk back up the hill. You also have a great interview with Margaret DeMars. She has fond memories of the schools back then and growing up as a little girl.
There was a picture that we showed about the big white school. There were these huge stoves in every room. And apparently, if you sat too close to the stove, of course, you would burn up, and if you sat too far away, you would freeze. But this building had a lot of problems. The basement used to flood, and things would go wrong with it. And there's a lot of, throughout the whole history book, there were stories about meetings where suddenly all the lights would go out for no reason, or water would pour in during a rainstorm. So
St. Anthony is a pretty rural area. The streetcars served northeast, of course, and then they served Columbia Heights. But St. Anthony was just an area that was set aside for future development.
Right. It really is about 50 years older than both Northeast and Columbia Heights. And it didn't have a streetcar, but it did have the buses came up the hill. But they only went to about 33rd.
And then in the 40s, still no high school there. They had to go to Edison or Marshall U. Some of the children went to Marshall U.
Yep. Which was right on the University of Minnesota campus.
But at that point, the war ended and the home building began in earnest.
When people came back from the war, developers were looking for open land, and St. Anthony had all these huge hog farms, and the hog farmers were looking at the money they could get for their land, so they started selling it off. From 1950 to 1965, St. Anthony went from being completely agricultural to completely developed in just 15 years with no open land at all.
What a big jump.
Which is another reason why there was a lot of flooding in St. Anthony ever since the 40s, because they filled in all the lakes and all the streams, which in the big rain, they would come back.
So that home effort then actually caused the creation of St. Anthony Village. There were a couple developers who wanted to annex their land into the city of Minneapolis because the city of Minneapolis had sewer and water.
Right.
And so that created quite an uproar in 1945.
The people in St. Anthony have always been very independent-minded, and their history involves a lot of fighting. And one of the things they were not about to do was become part of either St. Paul or Minneapolis. They wanted to be their own entity, so they got together, and there was a thrilling race down to the courthouse, and they got to the courthouse to incorporate their own village about 2 hours before the evil Minneapolis developers got there.
And that was E.L. Forsythe and Harry Johnson.
Right.
And so they didn't get their way. They ended up developing, but they developed in the village of St. Anthony.
The village of St. Anthony became its own incorporated city in 1945.
And as you close out the 40s, you have a wonderful interview with Margaret Dolly Scraga Brinkman, who was in the first graduating class of St. Charles School in 1949.
She told a wonderful story about actually her first day of school in kindergarten for St. Charles Borromeo. And she went to school, and the nun told everybody to sit down on a rug. One of the students didn't want to sit down on the rug, and the nun made her sit down. The little girl bit the nun, and the nun bit the little girl back. And Dolly said from that day on, she towed the line and was a good girl in school.
And that memory lasted 8 years. Also, at the end of the 40s, 1949, the St. Anthony Shopping Center came into existence.
The commercial center. It was originally there was going to be a movie at one part of it, and then it was going to be 5 sections. That's why the road that goes through the St. Anthony Shopping Center is called Pentagon Drive. Unfortunately, television was getting very popular, and the plans to build a movie house fell through. So St. Anthony Shopping Center became 2 rows of shopping.
And that became very popular in the 50s. It got built out. The Three Circles Drive-In was a big hangout back then.
And there was a Wynn's Drive-In and Sandy's Drive-In. Drive-in theaters, drive-in eating places were very big back then.
Very popular. And then you talk a little bit about the tornado in 1951. It was a big tornado, roared through the village, and actually 2 people were killed in that shopping center.
The roof collapsed when the rain came and brought the roof down, and 2 people were killed, and also there was quite a bit of damage at the Salvation Army camp.
And then 53 saw the fire department created. Seems like the people in San Antonio Village are very proud of their police department, parks, fire department, a lot of community pride in their institutions.
The city only has 8,000 people, and it's managed to keep its own independent fire department and police station. And they keep them very busy, and the fire department has more medical calls than fire calls nowadays, but they have a full-time fire staff.
The 50s also saw a lot of conflict between the people who owned horses and then the people who had to want to live in the city and have those amenities. You have some great stories about how that rub all happened.
I think there's some pictures of the horses in St. Anthony, but it was a classic case of the city versus the country, because there were still people that had bees, there were people that had horses, there were dogs running loose, there were skunks all over the place, and people were trying to have nice lawns and have a suburban life, and then
the horses come over and eat everything.
They would get their lawns planted and the horses would come running through. So then a lot of the ordinances that were passed in the 50s were control your dog, control your horse. This is Karen Miller. She was a cousin of the Ramberg family, and Karen Miller, in this picture, she's about 11 years old, and she's doing Roman riding. In the next picture, you can see this is her cousin, Dan Ramberg. These 2 kids started their own rodeo show, and they actually toured the country with a rodeo. And these horses were their farm horses, all 3 of them. It's 2 siblings and the father horse in the center. And they had this whole act. They traveled in a trailer, and part of their act was Karen would pretend to fall backwards off the horse, and he would catch her by 1 foot.
Oh.
She lives in North Minneapolis, and when I interviewed her, she can still remember the act, and she will tell you where her right foot went and where his hand grabbed her by the ankle, and she can go through the whole act. It was really entertaining for her to.
And this was just in the 1950s.
This is in the 1950s. They traveled for about until she got into high school.
Then the 50s ended. You had interviewed police officer Dick Puffer. Puffer. There was an incredible jet plane disaster over St. Anthony Village in northeast Minneapolis.
It was an air show on Memorial Day, and 2 planes, they were Panther jets, and they actually crashed into each other during this air show, and they both went to, they started to go down, and they both ended up crashing in northeast Minneapolis, with one pilot hanging dead in a tree, and the other one actually landed safely on northeast. He ejected, and the plane crashed on Northeast Field. And
you interviewed John Stingline, who was actually a witness to that event.
Yes.
That's amazing. People don't think you'd never have an air show now over an urban area like this.
John and his brother Mark Stingline, who is Hennepin County Commissioner, they spent their childhood in St. Anthony Village, and their father was a mayor of St. Anthony Village.
When was their father mayor?
I'm thinking it was in the 60s. Or, 50s, Merrill
50s?
Sting. It was in the 50s, Merrill Stingline.
Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about the 60s. That's the building of Apache Plaza. What a great shopping center that was.
There was a huge building boom of all the commercial areas in the 60s. Apache Plaza, the schools got built, the public schools were built, and a lot of the commercial businesses came up in the 60s.
In your book, you talk about the passion that it took to build that high school in St. Anthony. A lot of petitioning, as you say, a lot of arguing and discussion about that.
Well, people who were sending their children to the Catholic elementary school were not real in favor of paying taxes for public schools being built in the area. And one woman told me that she was passing around a petition door to door in St. Anthony to get the high school built. And when she turned her back to leave, people threw tomatoes at her. So there was quite a bit of fighting about the school.
But the school got built, the people kept moving out there. And with the building of the interstate freeways, the city council in St. Anthony was very alert when that 35 was being built. 35W.
They had to make sure. There was a big fight about that too with the highway department, because the highway department was not going to have access for St. Anthony residents to get onto the freeway, and so they fought for that and they won.
And that would be the Industrial Boulevard exit. Also at that time, the book, which I never knew, the street, St. Anthony Boulevard, changed hands from the park board to the Village of St. Anthony.
Yeah, and then Minneapolis changed the name of it. In St. Anthony, it's St. Anthony Boulevard, and in Minneapolis, it's St. Anthony Parkway. And Minneapolis asked St. Anthony if they wanted to change it to the Parkway as well, and St. Anthony said, no, we'll just keep it as a boulevard.
Good for them. The 60s also saw the very first Miss Minnesota come out of St. Anthony Village.
There was a club called the JCs, and they sponsored Mary Williams. And she became, first she was Miss St. Anthony, and then she was Miss Minnesota, and she went to the Miss America contest. She didn't win that, but when she got back, this was in 1968, when she got back, there was a huge parade in her honor. And she got the use of a ski-doo snowmobile. Jim Lupien gave her a convertible. And
well, the convertible I could see, but I can't imagine a young lady wanting a snowmobile.
They gave her the loan of a snowmobile, and she became a model for them for 9 years for Ski-Doo. And Jim Lupien would give her a new convertible every 2,000 miles.
Nice.
So it was
That's
a good deal.
great. Also, the 60s in your book, there was Medtronic became part of the St. Anthony Industrial Park. We think of Medtronic as this big international company, but it had its roots in Northeast Minneapolis and then later St. Anthony Village.
Palmer Hermansley was one of the founders with Earl Bakken of Medtronic. And Palmer Hermansley was a St. Anthony resident who also was on the school board.
And he appeared before them and asked for a sewer and water
Sewer and
hookup.
water for the building.
And this, again, this was the 60s. They didn't have a complete sewer and water.
They were still laying their infrastructure.
A lot of greenhouses back then.
Started with 4 greenhouses. 2 of them went under in the 50s and sold to developers, but there were 2 left, the Hertogs and the Johnsons. And the 1984 tornado took care of both of those. They were both leveled to the ground, and the Hertogs never rebuilt. J.R. Johnson still has a greenhouse, but it's in Roseville.
Now, in the 70s, new businesses continued to flock. Kenzie Terrace became even more populated. They had a pie shop open up on 37th Avenue with the Pillsbury Company. That must have been a big coup. Was there a Pillsbury executive that lived in St. Anthony Village and landed that? I
don't think so, but that morphed into Baker Square, and now it's IHOP. So it's that building's seen a lot of business.
And I also noticed they talk about the St. Anthony Millwork Company, John Hunter and Bernard Blasky, which were in that industrial park.
John Hunter told me that when they set up their business, he said St. Anthony was extremely easy to set up a business, and he always had great help from the mayor and the city council. And John actually became a Columbia Heights City Council member.
So he wanted Columbia Heights to be as efficient as St. Anthony
Right.
Village. Yeah, in the book he said that he chose to relocate there because the city was well run and it had a good police department.
Right, and there was land. Once again, there was open land for him to build a place.
Yeah, he was quite the businessman. That's the kind of backbone of St. Anthony Village, those independent people who risk everything as an entrepreneur.
Absolutely.
And then at that time, Silver Lake became an issue too because it started to get polluted and with the runoff from Apache Plaza. So a lot of attention being paid to the water quality issues back in the 60s.
I'm not so sure that the water quality is still that much better right now because I know that there's been a lot of hydrology reports and studies on it, but when Apache was built, it was dumping its water right into Silver Lake.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a lot of work done to rectify that. And now there's a Silver Lake Village is there, and there's huge holding ponds and a lot more corrective.
A lot more sensitive to the nature, yeah. Then, as you get to the 1980s, the headline of your book really caught my eye. It talked about it was a decade of siege and recovery, and that there was a lot of. You early mentioned the tornado that went through. That was back in '84, wasn't
1984. 1984. One woman died. About 130 houses were seriously damaged, and businesses. The tornado hit 3 of St. Anthony's 4 churches, and it ripped the roof off of Faith United Methodist. It bowed the walls out of the Trinity, and this is Midwest Federal. This building was completely, all the glass went out of the windows. This was up by Apache Plaza on Silver Lake Road.
That's amazing. Also in the 80s, you talked about that the water supply became contaminated, and the city was forced to sue the Army at the Twin Cities ammunition plant.
This was water coming from that Arden Hills Twin Cities ammunition plant and Honeywell. And Little St. Anthony sued the Army, it sued the government, it sued Honeywell, and actually won, as did New Brighton, which was actually saw more of its wells polluted than St. Anthony did.
And then, getting back to that tornado, I was fascinated in the book. Governor Perpich actually came that night and looked up some of the council members to offer his help, and then later did bring in the National Guard because it was such a mess.
It was quite something. If you were driving around and after the tornado, there were National Guard people with rifles, and there
checkpoints.
There was barricades where you had to show identification to get to your own home.
The council at the time, there's some great memories by Dick Enroth and Judy Mikowski, George Marks, and Clarence Ranello, who was actually mayor for many years, but they talk about that tornado as if it happened yesterday.
And they said one of the unexpected things in St. Anthony that happened was there were looters immediately. People were robbing televisions out of Apache Plaza stores.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, human nature. Sometimes there's a bad sign. And then at this time, too, the Kensington Senior Housing was developed, the Kensington Terrace complexes.
Where Mayor Clarence Ranello now lives.
Oh, yeah.
It was.
Good for him.
There was not any kind of big senior housing development in the area up until Kensington, and it was a big deal. And they had several false starts where the developer went away and then ran out of money, and then they got new developers. So it was rather painful for them to get that building built.
Mm-hmm. And then you kind of end the era of the 80s with a little bit of sad news. Don Leary Records closed. And what an interesting story. Started on Nicollet Island in 1931, moved to East Hennepin, and then opened in St. Anthony Shopping Center.
And I think some of his clients, I think it was Walter Mondale and Hubert Humphrey were among his clients.
He had it all. He wanted good music.
Everybody knew about him, and everybody went there to buy their records.
Yeah. So then we get into the 90s. You call that a time of challenge and wet basements. Apache Plaza's in foreclosure, but Rosemary Franzine, that was when she was first elected to the Hennepin County Park System, and through her 20-year career, she actually succeeded then in getting the Silverwood park built, the old Salvation Army camp. So what a dedicated woman she was.
It's a gorgeous park. Three Rivers Regional Park owns that land now, and St. Anthony residents were extremely happy to get the park district in there because there was concern that the whole area, which was the Salvation Army camp, it was all woods and lake, would be turned into housing. And so they were able to keep it as a park.
Great. And then you kind of close out the 90s, you talk about local businessman Roger Bona getting expansion. He got permission to move his gas station and repair operation to the Johnson Meat Market building. So Gail, we're going to wrap up our show here, but you got to tell us, how do we get this book?
Right now it's available at the St. Anthony City Hall, which is at 33rd and Silver Lake Road. And in mid-August, it will be available at commercial locations throughout St. Anthony and also in local bookstores.
So if our viewers want to learn a little bit more about the retirement of Father Kiddock or of the principal Gary Wilmer at St. Charles, they're going to have opportunity to get this book in the upcoming months.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, thanks for your time today coming down to Channel 6. And is there anything you'd like to tell our viewers about this book? Again, it must have been great to just put this together and interview everybody.
It was a lot of fun. Many thanks to the St. Anthony Historical Society, Barry Tedland, Bill Sauer, Florence Marks, George Marks. I had a good time writing this book, and I think there's 292 pictures in it, and I think people will really like to see those pictures.
Great. Well, thanks again for coming on and telling us all about it. We appreciate it.
Thank you.